There. I just started the recording now. I'll just say it again because I forgot to say it. Dr. Stephen Downs from Melbourne, Australia, talking to us about the status of parrots. And if you want to ask questions during the talk, please type something in the chat, which opens up on the right side if you click the chat button, and I'll keep an eye on that. And if not, afterwards, I'll open up for any kind of question. Without further ado, Stephen Downs.
Thank you so much, Amy, and hi, everybody. Yes, it's 9:20 in the morning here. I'm cheating a little bit with the Zoom background. That's one of the campuses of the University of Melbourne. Everybody's jumping on board the Zoom background business at the moment and providing images, or in this case, a little video loop. But that's actually what it looks like outside this morning, which is nice. The closest thing I could find, it's really bright behind me. You can sort of, or behind the camera, so you can sort of see the reflection off my glasses. But I've had to pull the blind down because it's a bit blinding. I get reflections off next door's windows and things. So, that's the best I can do with a little bit of natural Australian background at the moment. I've opened the window, so you might hear a bird noise or two from the neighbourhood. Look, what I'm going to do, and thank you for that very kind introduction, Amy. I may have fingers in a lot of pies, but master of none. You know, that's the problem. Nice to see some names I recognise and put faces to names as well. Some from Twitter, and yeah, very happy to be able to talk to you a little about Australian parrots. So what I'm going to do first is just introduce you to some of the parrots in my neighbourhood, literally in my neighbourhood, and then talk a little more about the situation for Australian parrots, with particular focus on the endangered parrots, and as Amy foreshadowed, how they have fared in the last couple of years with a very severe drought, with continued warming. We've had, I think, 5 of the last 10 years have been the hottest on record in Australia. So it's a real continuing trend. And the fires, as of last Christmas, New Year period, when they were at their worst, fortunately, although we had a very early start to summer in the fire season last summer, most of southeastern Australia, where I am, fared better in the late summer. Typically, our sort of wildfire season is February, March, late summer for us. Last summer it was terrible from sort of November on, which was really uncharacteristically early, and reached a sort of crescendo really in January. But then we had a much cooler, milder and wetter, at least in southeastern Australia, wetter late summer, February, March. So our fears are that, you know, it was going to be, the country was going to be burning right through till March, April didn't eventuate. But anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that. So what I'm going to do is share my screen, and so that I can show some pictures. And now I just have to find where that is. Probably get to share my desktop now, which should look something like this. Okay, so can you see a nice rainbow lorikeet on the screen there?
There we go.
Got that? All right. Well, he's my neighbour. He's peering over over the fence of my driveway here, looking over the top of a callistemon, a bottle brush flowering plant. Rainbow lorikeets have now become the dominant species in the skies of Melbourne and Sydney. And it's a little hard to know exactly what their status may have been before European settlement, but they're becoming so dominant now that some people are concerned, a little concerned that they may be taking over and pushing other parrots out of areas where they have traditionally resided. This is just a couple of streets away from me. This rainbow lorikeet is feeding in a eucalyptus, actually not eucalyptus now, it's a Corymbia ficifolia, which beautiful trees, very vibrant flowers in late summer, and these clusters that you can see. As a lorikeet, of course, it feeds on nectar and pollen. But this tree is not native to our part of Australia. Southeastern Australia is a sort of temperate, cooler temperate area. This one comes from Western Australia, as do many of the flowering plants that we've seen planted in domestic gardens, in parks as street trees in the last 20 or 30 years in Australia, in our part of Australia. They seem to be doing better as things warm up, and the lorikeets are really flourishing because there's never any shortage of food for them. The problem comes, of course, when they start looking for hollows to nest in, and they will use European, introduced Northern Hemisphere trees like this one that are in parks and gardens and well established. But the question is, are they displacing other parrots? That's one of the sort of big unknowns at the moment. As these guys continue to flourish, are other local parrot species, and I'll introduce some of those in a minute, are they missing out? So these guys you can hear any time of the day in virtually all of suburban Melbourne, and in fact right close to the city. Right on the edge of our inner city, a lot of parks, a ring of parks around the centre city of Melbourne. These guys can be heard. You can see them flying across the busy roads, and it wasn't like that certainly when I was young. So they're succeeding, perhaps at the expense of others, but obviously they're delightful to be able to walk through a city park and see this kind of colour. And of course, some people take to feeding them, sometimes the wrong things. They will aggressively feed on pretty much anything that people put out for any other bird. These guys will try and muscle in. So there have been reports of rainbow lorikeets eating meat, which is clearly not part of their natural diet. They don't feed on carrion or anything in the wild. But as soon as you put them in contact with humans, a lot of people like to put out a little bit of meat for our resident Australian magpies and kookaburras, which are meat eaters. If these guys see it, they'll sort of try and muscle in and just say, no other bird is having that, I'm having that. So that can also be a problem, potentially, that they're feeding on stuff that they probably shouldn't be eating because people are putting it out for them, for wild birds. And seed, of course, can damage their hairy tongues that are adapted for feeding on pollen and nectar. This is a musk lorikeet, and where you find rainbow lorikeets, you often now find musk lorikeets as well, slightly smaller than a rainbow lorikeet, and but very much the same diet and favour the same trees. How do they survive the winter? Well, we have very mild winters in Australia, in this part of Australia. It rarely, if ever, snows at sort of sea level here. The only snow you'll find is on our rather pathetic excuses for mountains that are a couple of 100 kilometres away from the coast. And the other thing that happens is that Australian native trees, and especially now that there are so many species being planted that aren't native to the particular local area, they flower at different times of the year. So right through the year, there will always be trees in flower, and lorikeets just move from tree to tree and area to area as things come into flower. So there's no shortage of food for them year round. So these musk lorikeets are, I actually like these better than the rainbow lorikeets. They're a little less aggressive, a little shyer, and their calls are a little less harsh. So they're kind of quite nice to have in the neighbourhood. Now, we saw Rosie before. These galahs, or rose-breasted cockatoos, or roseate cockatoos, whatever you like to call them, We call them galahs, which is derived from an indigenous language in a bit further north of here, originally, probably corrupted a little. Anyway, these galahs were in my local park, along with a couple of hundred others. A big flock of them seemed to have moved in, and so we were on a walk, and the park was full of galahs. So pretty much every day I hear galahs flying by in the neighbourhood, and perhaps catch a glimpse of them. They haven't dropped into my backyard yet, although they were feeding outside my mother's front door in a retirement village just a couple of miles away from here. So they're around, and they're around more frequently now in the suburbs than they used to be. One of the questions there is, has drought, has forest clearance sort of sent them looking for greener pastures, as it were, and sent them into the cities? Again, I don't remember seeing galahs anywhere in the neighbourhood. In the suburbs, when I was young, they were something that you used to look out for if you were driving through the country. And now they're definitely around. You can find them on the median strip of a highway close to the centre of the city. So they are, they've become sort of pretty regular neighbours. These guys here just happened to land. I was out visiting. I was looking at the place where my father's remains, his ashes, were going to be installed at, he died 3 years ago, installed at our large local cemetery and crematorium. And it was a bleak, cold winter's day there, but suddenly this flock of galahs flew in and really brightened up the area and started foraging in amongst, as you can see, the rose bushes and the plaques in the lawn cemetery. So again, you're likely to see them around now in ways and in numbers that potentially weren't, or that as far as I can recall, weren't around a few decades ago. On that same occasion, actually, this eastern Rosella, which is one of our very, most colourful local birds, stunning colours, actually, colour scheme, probably more deserving of the title rainbow than the rainbow lorikeet, actually, because they have, I like the arrangement of colours on these birds. Anyway, this eastern Rosella was in sort of supervising the galahs for a little while. Eastern Rosellas are more shy. They tend not to sort of come to your bird feeder, even if you have one. If you're lucky enough to be in an area where birds will come and feed, these guys tend to stay pretty distant, but they're beautiful birds. So, and they're a delight to see locally. But our fear is that perhaps the rainbow lorikeets are displacing some of these birds that were more traditional residents of close to the city and city centres and the suburbs here abouts. This one was doing a tightrope walk 2 streets away from here just a few days ago, landed and had a look around, and then headed off again. So I mean, we kind of tend to take these things for granted, but I know that when international visitors come and find that we have these parrots just living wild in our neighbourhoods, they're pretty amazed. And yeah, I think I've certainly come to appreciate that we have a rather special relationship with these birds here in Australia. On this one is in a local park as well. Happened to land in a good position for me to take some photos. So they're really quite stunning birds. What else is in the neighbourhood? Oh, well, here's his cousin, the crimson Rosella, and this is literally in my backyard. That's actually the view straight out of the window behind the camera from me. And one day I was just sitting here, and this guy, crimson Rosella, has happened to fly in, walked along the back fence for a little while, had a look around, and then flew off. But I have seen crimson Rosellas fly by a couple of times. So here's a better look at what they look like in the wild. When I had my proper camera, not just my phone on the desk, and managed to take a shot. So again, they are around the suburbs of Melbourne, as are, amazingly, in the last few weeks, these guys. Again, this is a phone photograph of we were on our walk, you know, exercising during kind of quarantine, and I saw some pine cone shreds on the ground on the street, and thought, that's interesting. There's a couple of well-established pine trees in the neighbourhood, and looked up, and sure enough, there were some yellow-tailed black cockatoos, a group of about 12 to 15. They love to feed on pine cones. We do have a lot of pines planted around here. They're not native, of course. These are Monterey pines, Pinus radiata. And then this one happened to fly down and land on the fence in front of me. So before they sort of took off to the high in the trees again. So that's a better shot I took in a nearby reserve. But they are magnificent. They're Australia's largest parrot. They're I speak in centimetres these days, but they're going on 70 centimetres. So what's that in inches? They're really approaching 2.5 feet long from top of crest to end of tail. So they're getting towards macaw size, really. So they're very, very large birds, a very distinctive cry and a very sort of slow flight across the air. Magnificent sight to see a flock of them. And I've seen them flying in our neighbourhood 2 or 3 times since. There have been lots of reports of these birds in and around suburban Melbourne, which surprises people, and they've asked, are they here because the bushfires have perhaps moved them out of their usual habitat? The answer seems to be no. There have been lots of sightings of them around Melbourne by bird watchers in the last 20 years or so. But I suspect that people who don't normally go out looking for birds in their neighbourhoods have been out exercising as they can because of COVID, have been perhaps spending much more time working at home, in the garden, paying more attention to the bird life around them. Seems to be the message. They have been around, and I've certainly seen them in the Melbourne area over a period of time. And if you look at eBird and other database records, that they have been around. They seem to come into town, feed on some of the well-established European trees when they're fruiting, the pine cones, the seed pods from liquid amber, which I think you call sweet gum or something in North America, elms and things like that. They love to get into the seeds of those trees. Although their more natural diet is a mix of eucalyptus fruits, and they love to land on trees that are infested with wood borer beetles. They can obviously hear the larvae moving around underneath the bark, and they then start ripping bark off branches and trunks of trees, looking for these insect larvae to feed on. So they're, again, just magnificent birds to see around. We don't see as much of them. And speaking of other cockatoos, I've hit the wrong button here, but not surprisingly, we see our sulphur crested cockatoos around. These guys are doing a little bit of lawn maintenance for someone here, which they're kind enough to do. So they spend a lot of time foraging on the ground feeders. These guys that are the long-billed corella, again in the cockatoo family, quite distinctive look with this sort of, I think you probably know them as bare-eyed cockatoos, but this particular long-billed corella has the what we call the throat slash as the distinguishing field mark here. Which and this is just in a local park. They come in, they use their long, curved, sharp bill to dig up tasty roots. They particularly like a grass that turns out is introduced, but is in many city parks and gardens, called onion grass. Different from the onion grass I think you have in North America, but this one's actually a South African origin, but seems to have spread everywhere. So they dig that up, and it has little little corms, little tiny onion-like bulbs that they like to get into. This is its nearest relative, the little corella, very similar in size, just a bit less dramatic with the red colouring and lacks the throat slash. But these are around, and they tend to descend in rather large flocks to the dismay of people that either tend sporting fields or golf courses. They're often blamed for ruining golf courses, fairways and things. And of course, they were here first, but they may also have been displaced from, again, they're more inland birds, but they're finding, they're adapting to the suburbs over the decades. And they will sweep into a park and have a good dig and then move on somewhere else. And occasionally you see them, very close to the inner city. You see a flock of them perched on top of some buildings in a sort of suburban shopping strip or something, and looking around. But they're not a nuisance like the much maligned Australian white ibis in Sydney and Brisbane, which affectionately or less affectionately known as bin chickens, because they're constantly in the garbage bins, pulling things out and hassling people for their lunch, and which, it's quite a large bird, an ibis, to come looking. Interestingly, though, in Sydney, the Sulphur crested cockatoos have been observed recently opening flip-top wheelie bins, people's garbage cans, these large plastic things, and that's the subject now of a proper scientific study by some researchers in Sydney to see whether the ability to open the flip-top lid of a garbage bin is something that's being passed from bird to bird in the suburbs of Sydney. So that's they've been calling for people to send in videos of birds getting into bins, opening the bins that you put out at night for the garbage collection. Amazing that to think that the sulphur crested cockatoos may be learning that kind of behaviour as well. And of course, little corellas are very well known as highly playful birds. I don't know whether anyone in the club has a corella or knows of people with corellas, but even in the wild, these birds are incredibly playful. They just seem to do stuff just for the fun of it. And these guys I saw in a local park, where these two were wrestling. It happens very often. One will flip on its back and sort of challenge the other to a wrestle. They'll do this. It's not really any aggression. They both stand up and shake it off and go on with their business, or say, let's have another round. This one obviously couldn't find a wrestling partner and just grabbed a stick and decided to wrestle with that for a little while. So this is the kind of crazy stuff that corellas do. And again, they're delightful to see around the suburbs. So that's my neighbourhood birds for the moment. That's this is the kind of aggression that we, I suppose, worry about in the rainbow lorikeets. They're becoming a bit more aggressive, certainly about defending territory, and where food is concerned, they are very aggressive feeders. So that's a bit of an introduction to the neighbourhood birds, the birds of my neighbourhood. Some of whom are actual neighbours, that drop in from time to time and that we hear, and some that you don't have to go too far to see. That's amazing. I think we've counted 15 or 16 species of parrot and cockatoo that you can find in the greater Melbourne area, naturally, that are native to the area. Obviously in slightly different habitats, some of them. So away from my neighbourhood, I'll share the screen again, and we'll go with some more. I seem to have missed the screen here. Where am I? There. That's right. So Now these guys are around the suburbs and are one of our least recognised parrots, amazingly given the colours. This is the Red-Rumped Parrot, and the most easily overlooked bird of all Australian parrots for some reason. They're sometimes called grass parrots, which is a term that, you know, gets used a bit non-specifically at times. These are from the genus Cephotus, Cephotus hematonotus, but they're more related to Rosellas perhaps than they are to the Neophemas, the other birds that get called grass parrots. So that's the male and the female. They're often around in parks. A lot of people, when they first see them, say, "I've never seen these parrots before. You know, this must be an escaped pet or something because it looks so exotic," but they're actually living around us all the time. This one is feeding in somebody's front lawn in the suburbs. Just amazing colours, and yet incredible to think that people often drive by them, walk by them without noticing them. They seem to have their heads down, feeding in the grass a lot, and they don't get noticed. No indication really that their status is changing. You can typically find them on sporting fields, often closer to our rivers and creeks, but they can be quite close to the centre of Melbourne. In fact, I was leading a little photographic group, a parrot walk, just a mile out of central Melbourne, next to Melbourne University. We have a big park called Royal Park there. And as we're walking back to catch a tram, a trolley, streetcar, whatever your language is for them, to go back right into the heart of the city, we're just about to get on the tram, and a pair of these landed on the grass right in the middle of one of our main roads, the main road north out of central Melbourne. Kind of unconcerned that we were all standing around with cameras, so they're around. That's a female perched in a bush. So yeah, they do have quite good camouflage, especially the females. If they're head down feeding, they can be quite hard to notice with that sort of grey-green, olivey grey-green colour. They don't have the red rump that the common name has. So it's a sexist bird name, as I like to say, the red-rumped parrot. If you met one of these at a party and said, "What kind of parrot are you?" and she said, I'm a red-rumped parrot, you'd sort of say, "Oh, really? You know, your rump doesn't look red to me." But anyway, there we go. This is a young one feeding, a young one bathing in a local park. Really quite spectacular colours, and you can see his little red rump there. These guys are also in suburban Melbourne, closer to the hills, in the sort of leafier outer suburbs. The Australian king parrot, that's a male with the red head. They are also adapting their diets to include, well, the Mediterranean diet this one is on. Perhaps he's worried about his cholesterol. He's getting into some olives there, eating olives from someone's front garden. And this is actually Canberra, so I'm cheating a bit here, but Craig is a newscaster. He's a news anchor for one of the TV networks in Canberra, in our national capital, and he has these Australian king parrots as well as some Rosellas, etc., coming to visit. Canberra is a fantastic place for parrots. They also have gang cockatoos as the sort of national, or as the emblematic bird of the city, really. But to have these large Australian king parrots coming to visit you and eating out of your hand, which you can do in parts of outer Melbourne and in the nearby hills as well. So they're birds I grew up with also on the southwest coast of Melbourne, where we used to spend summers, and strangely there's a bit of sort of temperate rainforest just inland from the beach there, from the Great Ocean Road, which is a popular tourist destination. And these birds live in the temperate rainforest there, and have been kind of trained to come down and feed from tourists in certain places. So they're very familiar birds to us. Just a couple of others that are in the Melbourne area, not directly in my neighbourhood. This is the purple-crowned lorikeet. It's a bit harder to find. but these guys were feeding in flowering eucalypts in the car park of a gas station on the road to Geelong. There was a whole flock. It's actually a hot spot for this species to find them in the car park of that gas station. This is another sort of semi-local bird. This is the blue-winged parrot. This one's a juvenile, hasn't yet developed a little bright blue band that it grows on the forehead there, frontal band. This is a Neophema parrot related closely to this guy, which is our much better known orange-bellied parrot. Probably the rarest parrot in the world, got down to numbers of 12 in the wild only 2 or 3 summers ago. The orange-bellied parrot breeds in southwest Tasmania, in Melaleuca, in a very localised area there over the summer, and then in the autumn, fall, flies back to the south coast of the Australian mainland. And really the only place they've reliably been seen in overwintering in the last few years has been just out of Melbourne, in an area that's really preserved wetland on the west coast of Port Phillip Bay, preserved fortunately for well over 100 years because a sewage treatment plant was established there, and the original wetlands were more or less preserved in conjunction with this large area that was sort of fenced off and has been a no-go zone. Apart from, lucky for us, for birders, you can get a permit to go in there. And that's been the only place where orange-bellied parrots, until this season, have reliably been seen on the Australian mainland, having migrated from Australia, from Tasmania. And of course, they migrate back to Tasmania. When the when the flock numbers get down to almost into single figures, the risks of a small number of very small birds flying that distance, which is over 600 kilometres, so sort of 300 to 400 miles, are very high, and the numbers dwindle every year. This year, the good news is that they've continued to release, to breed these birds in captivity, and they were releasing them to join the wild birds for their migration. A couple of years ago, that policy changed and they decided to keep all the birds together and then in the wild, and then round them up and put them as best they could and put them on a plane and fly them to Tasmania and back again, so that their numbers wouldn't be lost on the trip, just to try and boost numbers. The news this season is that there are upwards of 100 orange-bellied parrots now migrating back, having boosted the numbers in the last few years, now migrating back to the Melbourne area, and they've been seen in areas that they've not been seen in probably the last 5 to 10 years. So the numbers do seem to have grown, which is a bit of a success story. So I was lucky enough to see these guys in the sewage treatment plant, the Western treatment plant, and get sort of 15 or 20 minutes with these birds. But as you can see, if you look closely, these in fact were captive bred birds. They've got leg bands on, captive bred birds that had been released to join wild birds a couple of years ago. And that's probably why they were so tolerant of me pointing a camera at them for so long. They thought, oh, yeah, it's just a human. They'd been quite used to having humans around, whereas the wild birds are, the wild bred birds are a little harder to get close to. So that's the orange-bellied parrots. That's a bit of a success story among our endangered parrots. The other endangered, critically endangered migratory parrot that we have, and this is the only other one in the world, is the swift parrot. This is my one and only experience of finding a swift parrot in the wild in the suburbs of Melbourne. Again, this was in the university campus of La Trobe University, which is in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. Best photo I've got, unfortunately. I'd like to see them. They do pass through Melbourne. These birds breed in southern Tasmania, southern and eastern Tasmania, and they tend to pass through the Melbourne area, but also other parts of the south coast of Australia on their way inland, where they feed in box ironbark forests over winter, and then they make it back to Tasmania again to breed over the summer. The Difficult Bird Research Group, which is based at the Australian National University in Canberra, has been working with swift parrots and with orange-bellied parrots in Tasmania, with superb parrots which live in southern New South Wales around the Canberra area, with some other non-parrot birds that are difficult, that are low in number, that have particular requirements in terms of their habitat for breeding and feeding. That's what they class as a difficult bird. So they include the Regent honeyeater, which is critically endangered, the palm cockatoo in far northern Australia, and several others. So they've been conducting a research and recovery program in southern Tasmania for a number of years. The biggest threat to the swift parrot, and this is one in a nesting hollow in a tall tree in the forests of southern Tasmania, that's the same hollow at night, and that creature entering the hollow is a lovely, cute little sugar glider, a sort of a marsupial possum, flying possum type creature, really quite tiny, smaller than a squirrel. As you can see, it fits inside that hollow. That's the very same hollow. These creatures not only predate on parrot eggs, but they've even been found killing adult parrots, the female parrot that's in there looking after the eggs. It turns out that genetically it's been shown that these sugar gliders were introduced to Tasmania since European settlement. They weren't there naturally. And so they're predating on swift parrots. Now, that wouldn't be a problem, according to, I'll come back to Dejan Stojanovic, who's one of the key researchers and a friend who works in this area. It wouldn't be a problem, the sugar gliders, to the same extent were the forests that support the swift parrot not being continually logged. Swift parrot habitat is logged all the time for timber, and most of which is, substitutable for other material, but the Tasmanian and federal governments keep licensing areas, large areas of swift parrot habitat for clear felling, logging like this. And under those conditions, with smaller and smaller areas of habitat, the pressure, the fight between the sugar glider and the swift parrot for nesting hollows in mature trees, it has intensified. So what Dejan and the Difficult Bird Group have been doing is they've built this device that he's looking at here. This is from the TV newscast, called the Possum Keeper Outer, which was crowd-funded. There's a little motor here. They've put in lots of artificial nest boxes and then attached a motor to this, so that at nightfall, as it gets dark, there's a light-sensitive trigger that closes over the entrance to the nest hollow, so that the sugar glider can't get in. There's Dejan with one of these devices. So these were crowdfunded a couple of seasons ago, and they seem to be they've published a couple of papers now that they are managing to exclude sugar gliders from these nest hollows. Otherwise, this is still big enough for a sugar glider to get in. So that's been a really important issue. Dejan's always climbing trees to install these things, to check on baby parrots. He has one there to log what's going on, and to collect handfuls of swift parrot chicks, which he delights in, of course. But so the swift parrot numbers are down there's probably only 1,000 to 2,000 of them left in the wild. The numbers are still under threat. We're not sure what the the sort of trajectory is for their numbers in the wild over the next few years. But we hope that some of these interventions will make a real difference.
Stephen?
One of our other favourite researchers in parrot world here in Australia is Daniela Teixeira, who's been working with endangered black cockatoos, most specifically the glossy black cockatoo. Now, the glossy black cockatoo is interesting in that it has a very particular dependence on the casuarina tree. This is the casuarina, sometimes called she oak, not because it looks like an oak tree in habit or leaf, but because of what its timber looks like when it's cut. The casuarinas have these little cones. They're called, not strictly speaking, cones in the conifer sense, and these long needle-like leaves or leaf structures. And the glossy black cockatoo is very closely dependent on these trees for its feeding. That's pretty much all they eat, is a couple of species of casuarina up and down the east coast, the southeast coast of Australia. So this is from eBird. These are eBird data. Right down, now there's a little purple spot around Melbourne. I'll explain that in a minute. But basically these are birds that are found in coastal areas, mostly from just the very eastern edge of the state I live in, Victoria, and up the east coast to a bit north of Brisbane, and a little pocket inland in New South Wales as well. Now this area here is Kangaroo Island. Those sightings represent Kangaroo Island, where there's a particular subspecies of the glossy black cockatoo, and many of you will have heard, and I think some of you might have even contributed to the appeal to raise funds after last summer's bushfires. Much of Kangaroo Island, like a very significant proportion of this very large island, it's Australia's second largest island after Tasmania, was destroyed by wildfire, and the Kangaroo Island subspecies of the glossy black cockatoo was already endangered, and there was fear that it might be wiped out entirely. And so there certainly has been some crowdfunding and an appeal to raise funds. Oh, that's a picture from the Nicholas Rakatapari of just the massive areas of the island that were devastated by these fires. Just huge areas, vast areas. The good news is that glossy black cockatoos have survived and have in fact started laying eggs, and there are some new chicks on Kangaroo Island. So that is the upside there. Trying to get that population re-established when much of the vegetation and the habitat was destroyed in the fires is going to be a real challenge over time. And I said I'd come back to talk about this spot. Interestingly, in the last, this little purple square here represents only a handful of sightings of glossy black cockatoos very close to where I live in Melbourne, in the southeastern suburbs of Melbourne, several hundred miles really from where they normally live. They have been here in the last few weeks. The theory is that they've been displaced by the bushfires in this part of southeastern Australia, and perhaps they've come this far looking for food, for places to hang out, given that so much of this forest, and I'll show you a bit more about that in a minute, in southeastern Australia was severely impacted by bushfires last summer. So Kangaroo Island was affected, bushfires all over this southeastern area of Australia last summer, in Western Australia, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment as well. Really huge areas affected. This is the distribution of the ground parrot. Now, officially, well, most people recognise two species of ground parrot now. This one up and down the east coast and in Tasmania is the eastern ground parrot. This one here represents, these couple of spots here represents the western ground parrot, now considered a separate species, and also critically endangered. Now, the eastern ground parrot lived very much along here in coastal heathlands from the sort of lakes area of the southern coast of Victoria and around the corner here. Its distribution continues further up the east coast of Australia, but this has always been a stronghold for the eastern ground parrot. This is where the bushfires impacted in the same area of eastern Victoria. So you can see right from this lakes area and hills north of the lakes, right through to southern New South Wales. The yellow area was burnt in 2020, early 2020. The orange areas have burnt twice within the last 20 years. The red areas have burned twice within the last 10 years. And the pink and purple areas have burnt 3 times within the last 20 and in some cases 10 years. So this has been a recurring sort of fire event as conditions warm. And of course, this last summer's bushfires were the most extensive for decades and possibly ever. So this, as you can see, when you superimpose that over the distribution of the eastern ground parrot, basically from Cape Conran here to Green Cape there, look at that from Cape Conran there to Green Cape there, pretty much all of that area of coastal heathland and forest was burned. So there are significant fears for the eastern ground parrot. The problem is COVID struck just when the field surveys would have been out there trying to assess, just what birds remained after the bushfires, and a lot of that field work hasn't been able to take place. So we're a bit in the dark as to the fate of the eastern ground parrot, at least in this part of the country. In Tasmania, it's okay. Further north, it's okay. But its Victorian population may have been almost entirely wiped out by the bushfires, which is very sad to contemplate. The western ground parrot, again, some of you will have known about appeals for support for the western ground parrot. That's the t-shirt I'm wearing at the moment, which you'll see again when I turn my camera back on. This is an area of the Cape Arid National Park in southern Western Australia. As you can see, it's pretty arid anyway, but fires have burned massive areas of that over recent years. In fact, significantly reduced the available parrot habitat, and there's thought to be less than 54 square miles basically left of parrot roosting and breeding habitat in that area. The Friends of the Western Ground Parrot have become very concerned. They've had acoustic monitoring equipment installed because these parrots are very, flighty. They keep to themselves. They're hard to detect. They're down low in the grasses and low shrubs. So they've had this acoustic monitoring equipment, much of which has also been damaged in recent fires. So they've been raising funds to replace. This is Peter from Friends of the Western Ground Parrot handing over a new acoustic monitoring equipment to the government agency that's doing this. It's tragic that governments don't seem willing to cough up the money that's necessary to monitor, let alone to save some of these endangered species. It's an ongoing battle. Even where there are recovery plans in place, funding for threatened species in Australia is chronically lacking. And yet we seem to find money for all sorts of other things, but I won't get on my political high horse right now. But so they have been raising funds. And as of last night, after I talked to Amy yesterday, this news came through that the Western Ground Parrots have in fact been detected in the Cape Arid National Park. They have survived, and they have hurt a small number of parrots during their recent field trips, and now they're going through the thousands of hours of recorded audio data to go through and just get some sort of estimate on just how many of these parrots survive in this very small area of southern Western Australia. There's also a captive breeding program going on at Perth Zoo with very low rates of success so far. So Again, this is another difficult bird that seems to require very particular conditions to breed, and we may not be able to replicate those conditions in captivity. Much like, I suppose, the kakapo in New Zealand, where, I mean, those birds just don't survive, let alone breed in captivity, and the focus on their recovery program has had to be very much field-based in the wild. So that's my sort of run through of both my neighbourhood parrots and of some of Australia's most threatened birds, at least in the southern part of Australia that I know well. I hope that's been of interest, and certainly the update on the Western ground parrot, which came through late last night, is very welcome news. So the jury's still out a little in terms of some of the other birds and how they've fared after the bushfires, particularly because of the COVID situation, and much field work has been put on hold. So even surveys to see, you know, what was left after the fires in many cases haven't taken place because of the pandemic. All right, well, I hope that's been of interest, and I'm happy to take any questions or talk about anything you'd like to.
Okay, I just unmuted everybody, so you can mute yourself if you want again, but I'll open it up now to questions. I think this is just a fascinating topic, particularly over this past year. Australia's been through so much between fires and floods and drought, and maybe could you speak to, I know the temperatures have been getting steadily hotter and hotter in Australia. Are there some species that are being negatively impacted by this that potentially might not survive with the forecasted even greater heat expected in the future?
That's certainly, pardon me, that's certainly been discussed. Australian parrots in general seem to be comfortable with quite a wide temperature range. I mean, we do, when I say I live in a temperate part of the country, we do get days of over 40 degrees, say 110 plus Fahrenheit in summer. We do get down to freezing in winter. So it's kind of, you know, there's a broad temperature range. I think what we are seeing is that as temperatures warm, that certain habitats will become less amenable to parrots. So coastal areas may dry out more, certainly mountain and sort of temperate rainforest areas may become drier. And the average temperature may increase. So there's certainly concern for the blue-winged parrot, I know, as one that might not fare very well with increasing temperature. Basically, it's also semi-migratory in that it tends to spend summers near the coast and winters inland. If temperatures generally get warmer, it may find that more difficult.
We saw pictures back in the your summer of, I think it was sulphur-crested cockatoos that were falling dead out of trees from this was before the fires, from the heat. I was wondering why, because shouldn't they be adapted to the heat?
Yes, I think the combination of protracted drought, which in New South Wales and Queensland and southern Queensland, there was several years in a row of drought, which left sort of surface water much more difficult to find for birds. And then summer started really early, and there were temperatures of approaching 50 degrees Celsius or centigrade. So we're talking, you know, 120 plus in the western suburbs of Sydney. And that's, I think, where we saw birds looking really distressed and birds dropping from the skies, probably because of the combination of heat and protracted drought and the lack of drinking water. So that's obviously going to be a concern. A lot of the inland rivers of that part of Australia have have come under enormous stress in recent years too, partly because water has been diverted for probably inappropriate agriculture. Like we're growing rice in some of the driest parts of Australia. When you think of rice as something Southeast Asia, and rice paddies in very wet, high rainfall areas. In fact, massive amounts of groundwater has been, diverted out of rivers and streams to grow rice, to flood fields in otherwise very arid country. And it just seems crazy. Whereas, inland rivers that have supported huge populations of water birds, inland water birds, it's not uncommon to find massive flocks of pelicans and other things, several hundred miles inland in Australia. They're no longer supporting those populations. And I guess, the lack of rainfall and the lack of surface water collecting in dams and lakes and water holes has all of that combined over the last few years to create a sort of perfect storm, I think, for parrots and other birds. We saw the warm temperatures in inland New South Wales lead to some really surprising observations. Bird watchers in my part of Victoria, quite close to Melbourne actually, were seeing for the first time in their lives this bird, the crimson chat, hundreds of kilometres south of where it's normally living. And that was definitely, so we had what they call an eruption of the crimson chat in Victoria, a bird that you just normally don't see. And they were being seen in really unusual places last spring, summer. So again, that sort of changing dry and warmer inland temperatures have driven some species much closer to the coast and into areas we've not seen them before.
We have some more questions.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me, Amy?
Yes.
Yes.
Stephen, I have a question. In southern Connecticut and New York City, I think it's ringneck parrots, parakeets, I'm not sure, have become very popular, not popular, very plentiful. And some of the public utilities are looking to eradicate them. With all the parrots in Melbourne, do you have that same kind of situation?
We're lucky, but thanks, it's a good question. I mean, you're not alone there. And European cities up and down the UK now have very large established populations, breeding populations of these introduced ringneck parakeets, the sitacular parakeets, so the Indian ringnecks, the Alexandrines, that group from South Asia, basically, their original origin. And there are concerns in those areas, obviously, about them displacing native birds from breeding sites and from food sources. We don't have that same problem. We certainly have very few, if anyone sees a ringneck parakeet, then, an Asian ringneck parakeet out and free in Australia, it's almost immediately sort of noted and reported. It's possible there's a small group of some breeding in part of Melbourne that I've heard of recently. Authorities don't really take steps because they don't seem to be in the numbers that would create a problem here. It's really our own native species, though, that are causing problems by being introduced and displaced. So the rainbow lorikeet, which, as I said, is sort of taking over the skies here, it's a native bird to the area, but its numbers are multiplying, and that is of concern. Where it's not native is in southern Western Australia, so the city of Perth and around there. It's been introduced from escapees, escaped pets, perhaps from some, breeding aviaries or something, and in Tasmania, to which it's also not native. And in both of those areas, it is becoming a nuisance. It clearly is displacing some of the local species. In Western Australia, that's a particular tragedy. So it's because they have their own endemic parrot species. They have the Australian ringneck, or as it's called there, the 28 parrot, because apparently it makes a noise like 28. Its call sounds like the number 28. They have the red-capped parrot. They have the western Rosella. So they have some particular endemic species there that are certainly being seen less often, and rainbow lorikeets seem to be taking over in the suburbs there. In Tasmania, it's also a declared pest. So authorities there are taking steps, but they're not at the stage yet of threatening eradication. Where eradication and slaughtering of parrots in the wild has happened in Australia with the approval of authorities is where corellas have become a problem. And as I said, golf courses and things. There's certain towns where the local authorities, inland towns in Victoria, where the local authorities have bowed to pressure from sporting organisations and culled corellas that were, ripping up the golf greens or tearing up the cricket pitch or something. So that's a bit surprising here. As I say, they were here first, so it's not something I would support. Clearly, we're displacing parrots from their original natural habitat through forest clearing, through development, etc. And climate change and drought is only going to add to that displacement, I suppose. So to think that parrots, go off looking for a resource that they can't get where they normally hang out and then get culled because they're doing what comes naturally, that's a bit distressing, I suppose, for most of us that like parrots.
Are there any plans to do anything differently with fire season only a few months away again? Have they learned anything from last year's horrific devastation, and are there plans to do something else this year that might help save habitat and animals and humans and all that?
That's an excellent question, Amy, and it's a question that raises all kinds of very vigorous debate in Australia. Some fire chiefs complained quite loudly that they had tried to get the ear of the federal government before last fire season to warn that things were looking very grim, and that they couldn't get the government to take notice, and that the Prime Minister was sort of missing in action when the fire season started. And in fact, he was sitting on the beach in Hawaii, which was quite a scandal as the worst started happening. And that, so basically fire officials, fire ecologists, etc., said they weren't listened to, and that this was entirely predictable, and that the government didn't take necessary steps. On the other hand, there's been a backlash from people with perhaps vested interests saying these fires were all the fault of of conservationists who've put pressure on government to stop forest clearing and preparation for bushfire season, because you're not allowed to clear the forest on your land, and you're not allowed to do this, most of which is a complete myth. But that view has taken hold among certain sections of the Australian community that, it's all the fault of the greenies because the greenies won't let you clear the brush around your land anymore, and that's why the fires spread. Well, it's garbage, but it's been a divisive issue, I have to say. As for what preparations, what might be done differently this year, I've yet to see. I mean, I hope that the fire chiefs and fire ecologists have had a bit more, have had the ear of government to a greater extent, at least, so that there is more preparation this time around. But the predictions are that it's only going to continue to get worse.
Right. You have some more questions? And remember to unmute yourself when you ask a question.
I do. Do you have a big problem with poachers? And with COVID, with everybody, the resources having to stay home and whatnot, are they getting more aggressive?
We don't have a big problem with poachers in general here. It's certainly illegal to take any birds from the wild here, any native birds from the wild. In fact, the only real problem we've had with poachers in recent times is the government approving the export of certain threatened birds to this dubious German breeder private zoo in Germany, which is quite scandalous, actually. They managed to circumvent our quite strict wildlife export regulations here. Poaching for private pet ownership doesn't seem to be an issue here. I think, yeah, look, it's often said that, most captive bred cockatoos and Australian parrots in general around the world are probably only a couple of generations away from the wild. But, there's 100 years of breeding of cockatiels and budgerigars and whatever captive breeding in other parts of the world. I'm always surprised when I see an Australian ringneck parrot in France or something like that. I think, what? Because these are birds that I've only ever seen in the wild. I don't see them as pets here or as companion animals here. Cockatoos, cockatoos and galahs, yeah, they're more commonly kept here, but no, that they don't seem to be poached. There seems to be ample supply of captive bred birds here to meet demand from people who want to keep parrots. So yeah, I think the answer is here, not a problem. Occasionally there are. Sorry, Amy.
I was just saying, Nicole posted or Mike posted in chat that they said the same thing about not clearing brush in California when they've of course been having horrific wildfires as well. And
oh yeah,
without getting political, you remember a few months back it was said that they should just clear all the underbrush in California. Yes. That would stop the fires, which of course is a completely, utterly ridiculous statement.
Yes. Yes. We just to sort of continue in response to Vicky there are occasionally there are people caught trying to smuggle wildlife out of Australia. Caught at the airport with various wild creatures down their pants and things like that. Most often that is reptiles now, lizards, snakes, that kind of thing. I wouldn't want to be going on a long international flight with snakes in my pants, but some people, obviously the rewards are worth the discomfort and risk. Yeah, some of our lizards, especially sought after in other markets, but birds not so much here. Indonesia is a major centre for parrot smuggling. It seems, for poaching and parrot smuggling, as are, I know, parts of South America in particular. But Indonesia is a real hotspot for that. Often it's not for international trade from Indonesia. It's from island to island or region to region trade in Indonesia, which they're constantly catching people with cages full of protected or supposedly protected birds, being smuggled by boat from one island to another in Indonesia.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Oops, got a little anxious bird here. All right, well, if not, Stephen, thank you so much for talking to us. It's really great to hear from somebody who's been in the thick of what's gone on here. And anybody who's on Twitter or Instagram, please make sure you follow him. It's at Parrot of the Day. I think it's the same handle on Instagram also, right, Stephen?
It's true. I've been neglecting Instagram lately, though, unfortunately.
Yeah, I don't even do Instagram. I spend too much time on Twitter as it is. And but anyhow, you'll learn a lot about parrots. He's got a lot to say. You'll learn about things as you go along. And I just want to mention, by the way, just remind people, the club did make donations this past year to the Friends of the Western Ground Parrots and to the Kangaroo Island glossy black cockatoos. So I kind of wanted those mentioned so we know how they're doing. And I'm really thrilled to hear that they did find some western ground parrots alive, because we haven't been sure since the fires, and that was months ago already. They haven't been able to go in there to do any surveys, first initially because of the fires, and then after that, of course, because of COVID. So until you just said that now, I don't think we even knew that there were any western ground parrots alive. We didn't even know if this entire species had gone extinct. So it doesn't mean there are a lot of them, but at least there's some hope if there's some alive. And the same thing for the glossy black cockatoos on Kangaroo Island. We know that there are at least a few alive. We don't know how many, but it's pretty crazy when you can count on two hands the amount of individuals of a species that's alive. I mean, it seems like we don't really do anything till they're almost gone, and then suddenly it becomes an emergency. So it's pretty crazy stuff. But if there are no further questions, then I think we'll wrap this up.